Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Hello, BS listeners, and welcome back to another episode. Today, I am chock full of energy and enthusiasm because of my not one, but two expert guests that I have joining me on the show today. So with me, I have the president of Influence at Work, Bob Cialdini, along with Influence at Work's UK CEO, Steve Martin. So just as a bit of intro, Robert or Bob Cialdini, as he's known to his friends and colleagues, is the Regents Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Marketing at Arizona State University, ASU, and president and founder of Influence at Work. His books, including Influence, Yes, and Pre-Suasion, have sold more than 6 million copies and have been translated into 41 different languages and position him as undoubtedly one of the founding fathers of what we today refer to as behavioral science. His 40 years of groundbreaking work on the psychology of persuasion have led to some of the most important and notable findings in social psychology and informed some of the most important modern-day applications of behavioral science. In acknowledgement of his outstanding research achievements and contributions to the behavioral science field, 2 years ago, Dr. Cialdini was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019, to the National Academy of Sciences. So really, when it comes to the scientific study of human influence and persuasion, Bob is the most cited living psychologist in the world. And second guest, Steve Martin. Steve is a Royal Society nominated author in the field of influence and persuasion science, who together with Bob and Noah Goldstein co-authored Yes, 50 Secrets from the Science of Persuasion, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Business Week bestseller, which has now sold over 1 million copies. Steve's work applying behavioral science to business and public policy has featured in the national and international press, including BBC TV and radio, The Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Harvard Business Review, and Time magazine. He was the guy who wrote the original tax letter for the UK government that has become arguably one of the most famous nudges in applied behavioral science. His popular business columns are read by over 2 million people every month. Steve is faculty director of the Behavioral Science Exec Ed program at Columbia University's Graduate School of Business and is a guest lecturer on MBA and Exec Ed programs at the London School of Economics, the London Business School, and Harvard. Finally, together, Bob and Steve are the inspiration behind the well-known Science of Persuasion YouTube video, which I'm assuming most of you have watched, and it has been collectively viewed by now over 12 million times. So with all of that, Bob and Steve, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Nick. I'm glad to be here and with your listeners.
Me too, Nick. Good to speak to you.
So let's jump right in, and there's lots of storytelling and lots of I'd imagine some really amazing insights. So let's dig in right away. And I'd like to start by maybe taking a bit of a walk down memory lane. So Bob, I'll start with you. I heard a rumor, which that's never a good way to start off a question, but I will anyways, that you were never actually destined in your younger years to be a social psychologist / behavioral scientist. And if it weren't that, what was your sort of profession of choice as you were a young student?
Well, it depends how far back you want to go. If you go to high school, I wanted to be a center fielder. I was had a chance actually to play professional baseball and was dissuaded by the scout who was going to sign me when he asked me the question, listen, before you sign, kid, let me ask you, are you any good at school? This I was coming out of high school. I said, yes. He said, could you get into college? Yes. Could you finish college? Also, yes. Go to school, kid. You can't hit a slider. You can't hit a good slider. You're not going to get to the majors. Go to school, kid. That man is responsible for why I am in this chair talking to you now, Nick. I I I wanted to be Mickey Mantle. I wanted to be Willie Mays, and I wasn't going to be able to do it. I would have failed. And in I don't know how much you know about minor leagues. I would have been in some little city, Cozad, Nebraska, where the last place I played ball. And by the time they decided I wasn't going to make it, maybe I had a family. Maybe I had a was. What- I couldn't have gone to college then. I would have become the assistant manager of the Pizza Hut in Covent, Nebraska.
So is
So
it do you attribute it to the that scout, or to the fact that, what was it you say, you couldn't hit a slider?
I
Is
couldn't
that
hit
what
a
he said to you?
slider. Yeah,
So
slider
for our
looks like it's a fast.
non-baseball,
Yeah, slider looks like a fastball, and then all of a sudden at the end it's a curve, and I couldn't hit it. And I was going to see a lot more good sliders as I moved up the ranks. And so he did something that was really important to me. He said, "Look, go to your strengths, cultivate your strengths. Ask yourself, where are you really good?" He was asking me, "Where are you really good?" And it turned out academia was a place I was in. I was really good in in uh, in the academy, and he said, "Go there." I'll never forget him. I'll always be grateful to him. And I use that general piece of information for my students, asking them not to go where they want to be. I know that's a heresy to say don't follow your dreams. I'm saying follow your dreams if you're good at that. If you're good at the content of your dreams. Otherwise, you're going to be the assistant manager of the Pizza Hut, some version of that in in the end game.
yes. And do you remember, I guess, in undergraduate, coming out of high school, when that change happened, and you were convinced by the scout? Was it psychology was the first thing? What
Yes.
was psychology then? What did it look like? And did you always know that, you were obviously good at school and your studies? Was it always psychology for you?
It was always psychology, but it was not always social psychology. Um, I had never taken a social psychology course before I began applying to graduate school. Um, I had worked with somebody who was an ethologist who studied animal behavior, and I was going to go. I had already been accepted to go to school there, and uh, but I had another semester, and I had a girlfriend who was taking a social psychology class, and there was an empty seat next to her in the class, and I filled the seat. And by the end of that semester, I was more enamored of social psychology than I was of my girlfriend, as these things go.
Of
Um,
course.
and I quickly maneuvered and applied to a very few social psychology programs because the deadline was almost already gone. And the got in to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which was a golden time for me, and um, have never regretted that decision. I was going,
Hmm.
yeah, no, I was going to be an animal behaviorist. My first publication was on earthworms, alarm pheromone in Lumbricus terrestris earthworms, that was published in Science, the magazine Science. So my first publication was in Science, and it's been downhill ever since.
Science and worms to mere JPSBs and humans.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating story. And what was the what year? If you don't mind sharing with listeners, was your graduate was it graduate training at UNC, or was that
It was a
undergraduate?
graduate training. It was 1967 to 1970. I graduated in 3 years. It was an interesting time when I needed to get my degree for reasons having to do with the war in Vietnam and the likelihood that I would be drafted. And if I had professional degree, I would likely be in intelligence rather than in some army infantry unit. And so I put the pedal to the metal and got out in 3 years. And by the end of that time, I was deferred, and so I spent a postdoctoral year at Columbia University, where Steve is now, working with a grandfather of the discipline, Stanley Schachter, um, at Columbia.
Wow. So yeah, I have some questions on that, but maybe we'll circle back and pass it to Steve next. What was your foray into social psychology and behavioral science? And to add on a second question to that, what was the introduction? Uh, how were the two of you introduced
Right.
to each other? What was that meeting, that auspicious meeting, like?
Well, I used to be an assistant manager of a Pizza Hut.
No shit, you don't say.
No, no, perhaps not in Pizza Hut, but I spent the early part of my career working in the corporate world. I worked for a healthcare company, and principally in sales and marketing and training. And it was our business to understand and recognize how to influence and persuade others. And I'd read Influence back in the mid 1990s. And I actually, this is one thing I think that often surprises people who work in contemporary behavioral science. When Influence was originally published, because I think, Bob, it was 1984 it was originally published.
Yes.
So this is a book that was groundbreaking in the middle 80s. And I read it in the mid 90s, and it seemed to me incredible that there was a set of scientific principles that you could use as a checklist of sorts to come up with successful influence strategies. Because primarily I was in the business of being in a room with others like me around a flip chart, brainstorming ideas about what we think might work based on kind of best practices and hunches. And in early 2000, I, along with a colleague of mine, we had the opportunity to actually make contact with Bob through one of his colleagues, Kelton Rhodes. Remember Kelton? And they were explaining to us that they were inviting people along to come be trained in these fundamental principles of social influence theory. And a colleague of mine and I went along to Arizona State 20 years ago. That's where I met Bob for the first time. And it turned out that that was a pivotal moment in my career. Not only did I get to be trained by, the world leading authority on this set of insights, but it fundamentally defined my career after that. We decided as a result that we would work in partnership with Bob, and initially, providing training on these sets of principles that Bob had researched in those years of field experimentation and field study he was conducting in the late 70s and the early 1980s at ASU. And then subsequently, lots of things happened, which I could, in hindsight, tell a nice story about how how we planned for them, but we really didn't. We had an opportunity to write a book together in 2007, along with one of Bob's PhD candidates, Noah, who's now at UCL, a full professor there. And subsequently, that did pretty well. In the middle of the financial crisis, people were interested in how to change behavior, but didn't necessarily have the budgets and the monies to be able to put expensive campaigns together. So this idea that these relatively cost-effective but testable insights from principally social psychology could be applied was suddenly super attractive to policymakers, and as a result, all sorts of good luck and situations contrived to be a super fortunate time for us. And 20 years later now, here I am, still a long-term colleague and friend, obviously, of Bob's, and we're now in this era where we're getting the opportunity to take some of his fundamental insights and test and apply them in the real world, which 10, 12 years ago probably wasn't possible or wasn't easy to do. And so So yeah, that's the story. I have a lot to thank this man for.
That's great. And listeners, just to put it in context, 1984, I hadn't been born yet, so there you go, for what that's worth. And Bob, back to you, and on that point that Steve mentioned about within the academy. As a trained social psychologist myself, I know that you are the extreme exception to the norm of the typical academic social psychologist, at least the ones that I was around in graduate school, who those people have next to no little interest in applying research in the real world, which is a weird thing to be a psychological scientist or behavioral scientist and not have that interest. But it is what it is. And so what was it like for you in the, I guess, in your first faculty positions? Did you always know that you wanted to apply your research in the wild, and what sort of roadblocks did you run into when you were trying to convince, say, some of your colleagues that this applied focus was important?
I'll tell you the largest roadblock. It was trepidation about the consequences for my reputation within the academy. There's a quote from a British legal scholar, and I'm blanking on his name right now, but it is, "You have never heard true condescension until you've heard an academic pronounce the word popularizer." And so that concerned me, that the work I was doing in traditional social psychological frames and on traditional social psychological platforms was meeting the standards of the discipline. It's just that it didn't seem to be enough to make a difference beyond the academic audience who would read the journals, the psychology journals where I would put this research. It wasn't living up to the contract that I thought I was part of as an academic in the larger culture, which is, the larger culture says to me, "We're going to fund your research. We're going to either in a government or um, a funding agency, and so on. We're going to fund the research so you can find out about human behavior. And then you tell us about what you found so that it can improve the welfare of the culture, so that we know about human conduct and how it is instigated and what the implications of it are, so we can comport ourselves differently." Well, we never, as an academic, were living up to our side of the bargain. We just took the money to be able to do the research, but then we didn't transmit it beyond the the academic journal system that nobody read except other social psychologists or other academics. I often say that if social psychology had been a business, it would be known for having great research and development units, but no shipping department.
Yes, yes.
We didn't ship. We didn't ship the
If I
the
may jump in there,
goods
what do you think it was like?
Except to each other.
except to one another.
Yeah, you're like sort of just going around in circles at these different conferences. Like, what was it like? Because you think back, I mean, if you look at the history of psychology as a discipline over the 20th century and 19th century, there was time, like when you go back to William James and some of the like founding fathers, like they did have this application bent. They understood that contract. At what point, if we had to sort of speculate, or maybe did it become so sort of ultra theoretical and stayed within the ivory tower?
Well, I have a hypothesis about it, but here it is. All right, I have no empirical evidence to support it except um, my perceptions that it's likely to be part of the answer to your question. And that is, my home discipline, anyway, social psychology, started out allied with clinical psychology. The journal of the American Psychological Association, in which social psychologists published, was the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology. Right? That it was it, and so there was a clinical kind of frame, right, for what we did, and we then separated from the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. We had a new journal. It was the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and we had to show the world how scientific we were. That meant being in the lab. That meant using all of the measures and techniques and strategies, and even accepting the limitations of the lab in order to affirm our reputation as scientists, not just clinicians. That's not who we were. I don't have anything against clinicians, but that's somebody else. They do something else, right, than what we were doing. And so we put ourselves into that silo of laboratory researchers in order to live up to the reputation we wanted for ourselves as rigorous scientists.
I think about this a lot, and it's come up in the show in past, and it especially it felt really present when I was doing graduate school training, because I ended up settling on the topic of rituals of all things, and did a defense on the psychology of rituals. And it was very new in the discipline of social psychology.
Yeah.
The first empirical paper had been published 2012 when I was the first year of my graduate school training. And we convinced ourselves, and at the time I didn't see it, but I now sort of in hindsight look back. At the time, it was like I had to, and our team, we had to add to the literature of rituals, and the best way to do that was to bring them into the lab, which people hadn't done. And it's like, well, why do we have to do that? And it's exactly what you were saying, to convince ourselves that we were actually, in this case, we really wanted to infer causality, to know that it wasn't these sort of extraneous variables that were floating around in the air when you're in the real world observing a ritual, but instead we wanted to, manipulate these very minute variables and see what was driving the effects we were looking at. And we would submit a paper to a journal, and the reviewers two of them would say, this is great, it's in the laboratory context, it's novel, and you're inferring cause and effect, and of course they're psychologists. And then invariably we'd always have one or two anthropologists who would just shit all over it and say, what are you doing here? This isn't ritual. Like, you're creating something to examine it within a laboratory context. So that really resonates with me, and here I am a number of years later, and trying to do ritual in an applied context. And I think there's just such better ways to get at it. So do you think then that it's changing within social psychology, and as behavioral science, as applied behavioral science, does its thing over the last 10-15 years and gains popularity, do you think the academy is sort of looking at itself in the mirror and saying, maybe it's our time to change how we do things?
I don't think it's changing in social psychology. If I look at the primary journals, the frontline journals in social psychology, very rarely do you see field research, right? Where it's changed is in other sibling fields like marketing and behavioral economics, right? These are folks who think about their audiences as including the ordinary individual, right? How people in general respond, and they have they've set the standard for being able to do field research that gets at causality. Just as you're saying, Nick, you can have them both if you do rigorous experiments, but in field settings where people don't recognize that they're being observed, but they're naturally going about their business, and we change some aspect of the situation. Like I used to study littering behavior. So people are in a situation and we arrange the situation. Either there's litter on the ground, or they see somebody litter, or they see somebody pick up a piece of litter, and it changes their behavior when they go to their car and get a flyer on the windshield and have the choice of whether to litter it or not. So we can do that. We can manipulate the variables in that situation in a way that allows us control and randomization and inferences of causality, but it's in situations that uh, observers to the results can identify with, even if they're not academics. They can say, yeah, I've been in library parking lots. Yeah, I've been in uh, dormitory lobbies where I've been in this situation. I see what's happening here. It would happen to me there. And that gives us so much more credibility and applicability to the audiences outside of our domains, our professional domains.
And Steve, I'll be coming to you in a second. One final point on that, Bob, is do you remember, are there any conversations you've had in over your career where, I mean, the way you've just laid it out in that last sort of 30 seconds, it's like, it's so obvious. It's so patently obvious that this is the way we should be doing it, or at least including this aspect in our science. Would you be at, you're at a conference, like, I think of the big conferences of social psychologists and personality psychologists. Were people looking at you like you had three heads, when you mentioned this sort of stuff? And did you have to like convince and influence your colleagues and fellow academics that this was in fact, or that this is in fact the way to go about it?
I tried and was generally unsuccessful because of the reward system in academic social psychology. It's the number of papers that you get published in high quality journals. Well, you can, in your laboratory, you can do 3 or 4 studies, write them up, and send them to a journal for publication in the time it takes me to get the permission to do a field study in a natural setting, right? From all the stakeholders involved, and so it while they might agree with the logic of what I was saying, the logistics of it just weren't on my side, and so uh, I didn't really get it. Um, Now, I've tried to do that with journal editors to give field research more grace, even though we can't do 5 or 6 interreplicative studies and test all the various alternative explanations and mediations, because we're in the parking lot. You don't get to take mediational measures. You don't get to have people fill out this long questionnaire before they drive away. Uh, to give us grace on that, and I think there's some success there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, fast forward, I guess, to 2010, and there was this little letter in the UK government. So, care to share some of that story, Steve, of what went down there?
Yeah, well, it was 2009, but actually, we can trace the story to late 2006, back to Arizona, actually, and to a set of bathrooms in an intercontinental hotel, where Noah, Bob, and my co-author of Yes, was doing that now infamous field experiment, changing the words on those cards in hotel bathrooms that ask you to reuse your towels and linens. And traditionally they put that message that said, "Please do it for the sake of the environment," which actually is pretty effective appeal. But what Noah and Bob, and I think, was it Vlad that was involved in
Yes.
that as well? Yeah. What they found was that appeal to a descriptive norm, what previous guests had done, not only previous guests that had stayed in the hotel itself, but interestingly, and perhaps a little weirdly as well, hotel guests that had stayed in the exact same room, which is a little counterintuitive because you probably don't really want to think about what someone that stayed in a hotel room before you go into it got up to. But nevertheless, that was that set of studies, a room with a viewpoint, that became incredibly well known as a real world demonstration of social proof and descriptive norms specifically. And it turns out that there was someone in the Treasury here in the United Kingdom, because we wrote about these studies. Not only did the paper itself get published, we actually wrote about these studies, gave a practitioner's account in the book Yes. And someone in the Treasury read that book and phoned us and said, okay, right, well, you clever people seem to be able to get this to work in hotel rooms for towels. Could you get it to work in Great Britain for taxis? And we kind of, our response was, well, we don't really know. There's no reason why perhaps it wouldn't work, but maybe we write a few letters and send them out and see what actually happens. And that's what we did. What was really interesting at the time was, and probably a criticism of me, is that at the time I was so enthusiastic about rewriting these letters that we really didn't consider that much what the structure of a randomized controlled experiment would actually be. We just simply wrote 3 versions of the letters, sent them out to a group, interestingly, that the Treasury had previously tried to get in contact with, and they weren't getting any responses. So it was almost like, well, it's the last chance saloon, let's just send these out. And we suddenly got this extraordinary response back, in that initial set of what I'd call rudimentary tests, I think is probably as precise as we can be about how to describe them. We collected a couple of £100 million in extra revenue. And so that was about the same time that the coalition government came to power in the United Kingdom, and we were in the midst of the financial crisis, and a really bright team of again, a social psychologist, David Halpern, who was in the Prime Minister's strategy unit, who Bob and I had previously met in Downing Street a couple of years previously. David was selected to spearhead this new behavioural unit in the middle of in the centre of the Cabinet Office. And, we were at the first meeting there, and that's when we said, well, we've been doing these tests with the Treasury, and there was other notable folks in the room. Dick Thaler was there, Paul Dolan from the LSE was there, and Paul, who gave me a pretty rough ride, actually, in terms of saying well, you didn't do a randomized test, so there's no validity to what's actually happened here. And but interestingly, when I asked them, well, can I have the money then, they weren't interested in that particular route. So and there I think is the real interesting dynamic between kind of science and practice. In science, the question invariably and the reward is there for being right. Whereas what I've noticed in practice these last 20 years is rarely do people ask me the question, why would it work? Instead, they ask the question, will it work? They're not necessarily so interested in being right. They're interested in being effective in that moment in time, because that's probably what's going to define their next 6-12 months of their career. So that's how the story of the tax letters came about. And it turned out that it was a good precedent for then the behavioural insights team to then pick up and say, okay, right, well, there's a world of opportunity here. And then subsequently, these last 7 or 8 years, they've moved from taxation into health, into pensions, into job centres, a whole array. And the unit actually was spun out of government a few years ago and is now a social enterprise. So that's the story of how the tax letter, the original tax letter, came about. It was written one afternoon in my house. I think one November evening in 2008 or something. And but subsequently, Bob and I and our team at Influence at Work have been able to I guess, open people's minds to the application of these influence insights in a whole broad array of not just public sector and but private sector environments too. So, we've been running experiments in transport. How do we reduce fare evasion? We've been, looking at how we can, deal with some of the bigger problems actually in society these days, not just increasing sales or increasing the effectiveness of a marketing campaign. How do we get more people onto public transport? How do we reduce dishonesty in society? How do we get people to be a little more careful about their communities and be a little bit more caring of our future society? And I think that's probably a direction that will continue to move in. But equally, we've been doing stuff on, it's not unusual for me, we're in lockdown at the moment, but to be, running an experiment on an aeroplane, looking at, what seat has the biggest influence over the number of cups of coffee that are sold if the first person buys one, or, what can we do with upstate New York bus drivers to get them to be compliant with safe driving practices? All these very, important, overlooked, but crucial everyday behaviors that if you can make a small impact or indent on, can lead to huge advantages, and it could be cost savings, it could be market share in the case of planes, and marketing endeavors, and it could be lives saved in the case of safe driving.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The letter is a gift that keeps on giving. A preprint just came out this week. I can't remember some Central South American country, and what they ran was, I don't know how many separate treatments or conditions they had, but the two that were the most effective were sort of a combined approach. The first was a pretty strong threat of being sent to prison if you didn't, if you, and it wasn't total tax evasion, it was if you sort of gave incorrect information.
Right.
But what really sort of, and then the title is the $100 million nudge. And what I guess, as far as the results I was looking at, what sent it over the $100 million mark was in collecting tax revenues was the pointing out the fact that a person couldn't say it was accidental, and that instead it would have been perceived, by the officials as intentional. That simple change in language in the letter was enough to have a 3x effect.
This was in the Dominican Republic, I think, wasn't it?
Yes, Dominican Republic. Yes.
Yeah, and so that same intervention was actually, so we tested a similar one for parking fines. So if you send a letter after you're given a parking violation fine, we found that if you write on the letter, if you choose not to respond to this letter, we'll see that as an active commitment or an active choice to actually avoid paying, and we'll deal with you accordingly. So that was one such, and I love these little ideas. In Ireland, for example, when we sent letters to people that had been given a fine for free riding on the train, we found they were much more likely to pay their penalty on time if we enclosed a map of how to get to Dublin Courthouse in the letter. So it's just like, oh God, these guys are serious, And,
so, they have a map.
Yeah, but what's really interesting is that, and this I think is an example of how then we get these opportunities to work on all these various different environments. So you look at that at a surface level and you think, oh right, if I just tell my audience what everyone else is doing, that's a really surefire route to influencing behavior. And well, yeah, that's true, but don't forget that it doesn't kind of discriminate between whether behavior is desirable or undesirable. And so, a couple of years later, in 2012, we ran these studies in health centers where it seemed quite a common practice for medical centers, medical doctors and their staff to put these big signs in healthcare waiting room areas decrying the large number of people that failed to turn up for their appointment. It said like last month, 170 people didn't turn up for their appointment. And there they were thinking, well, this is clearly everyone's going to see this, let's see how many people do it and the cost, and they're not going to do it. None of them actually really stopped to think that actually doing that might actually lead to more people not turning up for a couple of reasons. One is, well, look at how normal it is. And the other reason, of course, is that the only people that actually see the message are the people that actually turn up. So it's a ridiculous message anyway. So yeah, and but what's really, I think, really important to recognize here is that how a lot of these fundamentally basic insights into human psychology first came from this guy here who was studying it back in the 70s in those kind of field experiments and those field observations in the real world. I mean, one of the things that's really remarkable to me is that it's taken us like 40 years to kind of cotton on to what this guy recognized 4 decades ago.
And on that point, I think that's true. If either of you had to sort of speculate or hypothesize, why the lag time to get your work on influence and persuasion out there to the masses? Like, was it a sort of a market thing? Was it a timing thing? What is it? Why is it now sort of all of a sudden taking off?
One reason is um, the the association with behavioral economics. We've gotten credibility associated with the queen discipline of economics that has always had public figures genuflecting in its direction, right? Uh, Partially because of the rigor of it and so on. Well, many of the past winners of the Nobel Prize in economics have been behavioral economists who share a set of values and even methods with social psychologists and behavioral psychologists. And so we get we get our boats uh, uh, elevated by that association. The other is, and Steve and I are I don't know if guilty is the right word for this, but we're certainly participants. Behavioral scientists are now starting to write for popular audiences for the first time, right? We weren't, partially because of that fear I mentioned earlier about being perceived as a popularizer, which was some kind of denigration of the job. Um, no, we're now making our information accessible to large portions of the culture who did not know what we were doing and who like it, who see that it has value for the way that they arrange themselves in their lives and understand what's going on in their lives. And so we're getting that affirmation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Also, by the way, as is demonstrated in the letter that Steve was talking about, the the consequences, the the outcomes of our procedures, of our practices, of our techniques, and so on, are unprecedented in terms of how cost effective they are.
Yes.
Steve's letter changed a few words on a page on something that was being sent anyway. You didn't even get more postage involved, and hundreds of millions of pounds have resulted. That's the kind of cost effectiveness that gets not just people in general, it gets decision makers paying attention.
Yeah. Yeah. And with that, and influence at work has been 20 plus years. Do you see a shift in the market? Do you see greater appetite for these types of behavioral science or psychological interventions within in this case, for profit or businesses? If we were to compare now those decision makers versus 20 years ago, those decision makers, what has changed,
Yes,
if
that's
anything?
we have seen an uptick and more interest in. Oh, well, folks seem to be onto something. Can you tell us how we can manage our sales force, our our marketing budget, our recruitment processes, and so on. Um, and right, so uh, we we run training programs several times a year, and they're sold out every time.
There's
To
something,
to the
yeah,
to the
yeah.
to the economic community, to the business community. How do you use these principles ethically and effectively? Sold out every time.
Hmm.
And there is, Nick, there is one thing that I think has changed, and there's also, importantly, one thing that certainly has not changed, which we should also remind ourselves of. The thing that has changed these last 10, 15 years is increasingly, whether it's a product you're selling, whether it's an idea that you have to propose or a proposition that you're putting out to the market, there are increasing numbers of competitors with a similar, if not the exact same proposition or proposal. And so perhaps in the past where you've had differentiation between, a brand or a product or an idea, this is different because of X, Y, and Z. It's really, really easy now to replicate an idea or a product or an innovation, ridiculously quickly. I was reading an article the other day that was actually saying you see something on the catwalk in terms of an innovation, and there are others that have copied it before the original's actually even out there on the market. So this idea of it's not enough just to have a good proposition anymore, because everyone's got a pretty good proposition and they're very increasingly hard to differentiate between. So that's something that I have noticed that's very much changed. And as a result, the way you present an idea will often be vastly more important than what the actual idea is itself. Um, and we find that whether it's an idea, we actually even find that we've recently been doing work on the psychology not of an effective message but the effective messenger. Why is it that someone can present an idea that will largely be ridiculed and rejected by an audience, yet that same audience will accept it enthusiastically if someone else comes along and says the exact same thing? And we've all experienced that. You've gone into a meeting room, you've had an idea, and people go, "Oh, that's a ridiculous idea." And then someone else comes in. It's generally a well-paid consultant with a briefcase and a shiny suit who says the same thing, and then everybody goes, "Wow, that's wonderful." And you're left sitting there thinking, "I've been saying that for months. Why didn't anyone listen?" So that has to speak to not the content of necessarily what's being presented, but in that case, who or how, the context in which it's being presented. So that's certainly changed. The one thing that hasn't changed, though, I think it's worth reminding ourselves of, is that almost invariably at the end of the day, um, the vast majority of problems and challenges that businesses that come to us are experiencing have people at their core. They're not an engineering problem. They're not a product innovation problem. They are an execution problem or a sustainability problem or a something that requires the human part of the machine to function differently. And climate change is probably the best and probably most harrowing example of that at this moment in time. It's most of these big societal challenges that we actually face are people problems,
Hmm.
really.
Well, that's a perfect segue to my last question for you guys, which is the BBB, or the big behavioral brainstorm that I ask all my guests on the show, and now we're going to get two responses. So um, I'm gonna say Bob's gonna go first and Steve's gonna go second, which means Steve, you're gonna have to come up with a unique answer if yours was the same of what Bob was gonna say. So you have a bit more of a challenge ahead of you. So yeah, the BBB is of all the problems that are facing our world in 2020 seems to be chock a block of them. Which one and only one would you choose that could stand from a behavioral science or a psychology related solution? Bob, to you first.
Well, it turns out it may be just one because I'm going to copy what Steve said, and it's climate change. It's the environment and how we interact with it. It's existential, and so we have to deflect our energies there. Few decades ago, when I was just studying uh, topics on which I could persuade people to move one way or another. I could influence them to make a choice in favor or against by the way I presented the persuasive appeal. Um, I thought to myself, wait a minute, there's a there's a better way to use the knowledge that comes out of these experiments than to be studying whether we should put a stoplight at the corner of such and such and such and such. You know, uh, no, it should be how do we get people to move in environmentally friendly directions based on how we frame the message. Um, and that's what I continue to believe is the BB. What did you say? The BB what?
BBB.
BBB.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there it is. And so
Yeah.
for the last 3 decades, I've spent the majority of my time trying to understand not just the social influence process, but the social influence process in the context of moving people in more environmentally sound and protective ways.
Mm-hmm. And Steve?
Well, now that that was going to be what he said, but maybe I can add to it and provide it,
Sure.
an answer in a
Sure.
slightly different way. And as I was listening to you both speaking there, I was thinking about openness, and I'm thinking about openness in a few ways. So first is, how do we persuade people just to be a little bit more open-minded to the variety of ideas and information that's actually available to us? We have become vastly and overly tribal. And as a result, I think there's all sorts of unintended consequences to that, in terms of who we choose to listen to, who we choose to believe, who we choose to dismiss, um, even when these people are saying the exact same thing. So maybe there is some help that behavioral scientists could provide in terms of ways in which we could encourage a little bit more open mindedness across a society. And I think we need to be more open to the fact that behavioral science is not a panacea. It's not the fix all. You hear about all these groundbreaking, eye catching, headline grabbing insights. Change a few words on this letter and collect this amount of money. Change this context or environment, and this is the impact you actually get. But a lot of the stuff that we actually do often doesn't work. So I think we need to be open to that, and I think we need to be open to encouraging as many new, young, talented graduates to come join our organization as well. One of the things that Bob and I are super lucky to have, particularly in our UK office, is a team of incredibly young, incredibly dynamic and bright young behavioral scientists. What's really encouraging to me, and I think we should be open to encouraging as much of this as we possibly can, is that because we're in what I think Bob described as this golden era of behavioral science, no surprise that that's what a lot of youngsters now that are completing their undergrad studies, thinking what are they going to go and do in grad school, they're turning to the behavioral sciences, and we should be looking to create as many opportunities and openness to welcome them into our organizations, because we do have these big huge challenges that we need to face and we need to deal with, and we're going to need a community of qualified behavioral scientists to be able to advise on these issues of climate change, of fake news, of all these other things. And so I think, that would be my response to your question.
That's great. Yeah, and as I can continue to lecture at my alma mater of University of Toronto, I can't remember how many conversations I've had with fourth year graduate undergraduate students and even master's students who have a up and coming graduation, and they have no idea what to do, and I tell them, I'm like, there's this whole field, there's this whole thing, guys. So there's this talent, there's this there's these undergraduates and graduates who are trained, and yet there's some sort of market failure there because they just don't know that we are out there, that our organizations and businesses and companies are out there. So I still think, while it is the golden era of behavioral science, still a lot of work for us to do to get the name out there and to attract that young talent, because these problems will be around for some time to come, if I had to guess. Well, guys, I could keep you forever, but I've already kept you beyond time. So last thing I want to say is thank you so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Nick.
I enjoyed it.
Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting and easy to apply sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. The show is edited and co-produced by Laura Christine and Noelle Rain, and all visual artwork, banners, and animated GIFs are created by the talented Iris Deng of dengit.org. That's DENGIT.org. Check it out. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. A lot of work goes into these episodes, and a little love would go a long way. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.